Please, then.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak on Bill C4 and to follow many of my colleagues from the NDP who have been pointing out the serious flaws and problems with this bill that is before us. And of course we all remember this bill as it was previously presented as Bill C49 in the previous Parliament. And I want to begin my remarks today by just registering my concern of what I've seen over the years from this government, where it seems to me that refugees have become scapegoats. They've become a political football to target and in many ways to tarnish. And I think that the bill before us today, continuation of Bill C49, is a bill that seeks to do that. I've been listening to the debate today in the House, and I've heard Conservative members saying that smugglers should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and this is about going after smugglers. But as my colleagues have pointed out, in actual fact, this bill really doesn't speak to that issue. In reality, Parliament did pass a bill a few months ago dealing with refugees, and in fact already the laws that we have do have provisions that ensure that there's a life sentence for human smuggling. So it does raise a very serious question as to why this bill is coming forward and what its real what the purpose of this bill is. I know when the bill was originally introduced in the previous Parliament, there were many organizations such as the Canadian Council of Refugees, Amnesty International Canada, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian Bar Association, the Centre for Refugee Studies, who all examined the bill and in a very thoughtful way pointed out the serious problems that were contained within the bill. Now, these are organizations that study this issue not from a partisan point of view, but from a neutral point of view of whether or not proposed legislation is actually harmful or whether it is actually assisting with our refugee process. And I think all members of the House and certainly the government should be aware that this bill was resoundingly negative in terms of the response it got from the organizations that work very closely with the issue. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think we in the NDP have significant concerns. We're very concerned that the bill basically allows two classes of refugee claimants. I think it allows designated claimants who will be then mandatorily detained, including their children. And I think it's very powerful that many of our members today have spoken about their feelings on this aspect alone. What does it mean to incarcerate and detain children or to not allow family reunification? This is a very serious problem with the bill. Mr. Speaker, I remember a few years ago when another boat arrived off the coast of BC from Fujian province in China, and dozens of claimants were detained. I remember visiting them in jail in Burnaby in British Columbia, and I remember the incredible issues and concerns that they had in terms of not having access to lawyers, not being able to make proper phone calls, not having culturally sensitive provisions and food, being separated from their family. That was a few years ago. This bill wasn't even in effect at that time, and I remember delivering a whole series of letters from the detained women from Fujian province to the minister, imploring the minister to address their grievances and the situation that they were faced with, where they stayed in jail for many, many months. So that was even before this bill. If this bill goes through, Mr. Speaker, we will see a system set in place that, first of all, gives enormous power to the minister. This is something, notwithstanding any other provisions, we should be very, very worried about. We've seen so much legislation from this government that centralizes authority and power and decision-making and discretion within the minister. Why on earth would we undermine our system overall and confer such extraordinary powers on the minister to designate claimants and then, as a result, place them in detention? So that alone, Mr. Speaker, is a very serious problem within this bill. You know, I think Canada has had a reputation of being a fair and reasonable country in terms of protecting refugees and their rights and providing a settlement in this country and upholding international law. And yet, again, many of us today, in expressing our thoughts and concerns about this bill, are pointing to the fact that this bill itself may end up in a charter challenge. It may be in convention, in contravention of international treaties. And it really leads me to wonder why this bill has come forward. Why are we targeting in this fashion when we already have provisions in the law that deal with human smuggling? We already have provisions in a new refugee bill that produce a more balanced result. Why is this particular bill coming forward? And I have to say that I've come to the conclusion, like I think many others, that it's more about a political line, a political optic that the Conservative government wants to lay down, that it's like they get tough on crime. It has nothing to do with dealing with real issues and complex situations. It has everything to do with just laying down a very simplistic approach that is giving more power to the minister and actually stripping away the rights that we've had in this country for refugees. Another provision that I would point out in the bill that is very problematic is the fact that designated claimants are denied access to appeal. They cannot make a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application. These are all hallmarks of the system that we have in place. As members of Parliament, they're actually provisions that we use. We hear from constituents who are in often very difficult situations, have come from another country, go through the process, and may end up making a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application to the minister. And yet here we have this bill that all of a sudden won't allow that to happen. So it seems to me that this is a very serious step that is being taken. And I would note that in the previous Parliament, the three opposition parties adamantly opposed the bill. And in fact, the government didn't bring it forward because they likely knew it would be defeated by a majority in Parliament. Well, now we have a majority Conservative government, but it does not deter us in raising these significant points and alerting the public that while the government might be catering and fear-mongering and putting a political spin on this, the reality is that this is very bad legislation, Mr. Speaker. So I actually want to thank the organizations that have taken the time to go through with that thorough examination and to give us the analysis that helps us see the reality that this bill is very bad. You know, in today's global world, it seems to me that it's very ironic that we have a government that is hell-bent on allowing capital to move wherever it wants with no restraints. We have a government that has at the top of its agenda trade agreements that have virtually no restraints. So all of this idea of freedom of movement in the globalized world, and yet when it comes to people, when it comes to the real resource of our world, humans and their capacity to produce and to live productive lives, we see this kind of draconian legislation that's aimed at slamming people who may be making a very legitimate refugee claim in this country, who may be fleeing persecution, who yes, may have been taken advantage of and exploited. And there's no question that we need to focus on the problems that exist with human smuggling. And as I've pointed out, there are already very stiff provisions that deal with that aspect. But this bill does not speak to that. This bill is targeted at the refugee claimants themselves, is targeted at the people who are in that situation if they arrive by boat. So this is bad legislation. I'm very proud that New Democrats are standing up against it and pointing out the problems with this legislation. And I hope that if it does go to committee, that we will have an opportunity to go through this bill in great detail and to make substantive changes and to try and come to some recognition that the bill as it is cannot go forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Cape Breton Cancel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this has been This has been a very enlightening debate. Certainly, one of the things that one of the references that I've heard during the course of this debate was the misnomer in the title of this particular bill, and it's been referred to by one of my colleagues here as a Refugee Punishment Pact, as opposed to the title that the government have on it. Mr. Speaker, I know my friend from Vancouver East. She comes from an area of this country that's been very welcoming to new Canadians over the years, and certainly the broader community around that. The picture that's trying to be painted on the part of the government, on the government's part, for this legislation to justify these changes has been one of an outright rash of illegal refugees coming to the borders and certainly through BC. Is that her experience? Is that what she knows to be true in this particular issue?
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Cape Breton for his thoughtful comments, and he's entirely correct that I think we have had isolated cases where people have arrived by boat, and of course the media has, the government has really stoked that fear from people. I can remember some situations where that has occurred, but there's probably more people that arrive by plane, for example, or over the border. Very little attention is paid to that in terms of specific legislation. So I think it really, again, demonstrates for us that this legislation has been targeted to a very specific group that is way beyond the issue in terms of what's actually taking place. We already have stiff provisions around human smuggling. We already have other laws that deal with our refugee system. And so this legislation is way over the top. It's bad legislation, and I think that's why we're clear we need to change it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for her eloquent words, and to thank her also. She helped me in the past during my wife's immigration process to this country. Does my colleague agree that the government is dangerously trying to sow cultural intolerance and division among Canadians? And could she elaborate the effect that this fear-mongering and targeting of refugees and immigrants will have on the very fabric of Canadian society?
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, very briefly, I thank the member for his question. I think it's very thoughtful, and I think it's one that the government doesn't want to answer. They want to run for cover. But the fact is, when you look at this legislation and when you look at their agenda as a whole, it is about division. It is about scapegoating people. It's about targeting people. It's about using optics in the media and playing on people's fears. I can't think of a worse kind of public policy agenda. I think most Canadians are abhorrent of that kind of agenda, and yet here we have legislation that is clearly targeted to meet a political end for this government. That's something that we can't tolerate.
Questions and comments? Questions and comments? Resuming debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
Mr. Speaker, the people of BC have spoken loud and clear. In an historic referendum, they rejected the HST tax grab that the Prime Minister rammed through this House. Now the Conservatives are planning to punish British Columbians. Forcing them to pay back over $1 billion is a spiteful reaction to the province's fair and democratic decision. Mr. Speaker, when will this government agree to respect the voters and treat BC voters fairly?
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure the member opposite knows, there's an agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of British Columbia. HST is a provincial responsibility. I met yesterday with the Minister of Finance of British Columbia. He reported to me, of course, the results of the referendum there, and we're now working on the exit strategy. Since this is a provincial responsibility, the provincial government will not be continuing with the HST.
Member for Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this money has already been invested in healthcare, education, and other family priorities. Forcing the province to pay it back will hurt very important services and create a hole in the province's budget. Mr. Speaker, this government needs to do the right thing, the fair thing. So I ask again, will they drop their plans to punish British Columbians for rejecting their HST?
Minister of Finance.
The HST is a provincial responsibility. There's an agreement between the Government of Canada, Mr. Speaker, and the Government of British Columbia. The agreement has provisions with respect to repayment of the sum that was advanced by the Government of Canada. That sum was advanced as part of the agreement to proceed with the HST. They're not proceeding with that now, so it follows that honoring the agreement will require repayment.